Good afternoon. I'm Lee McTighe, and thanks for joining me here today for a look at the old burying ground on Highland Street in Townsend. It has been said that a gravestone is placed not because someone died, but because someone lived. So let's begin not in the cemetery, but by looking at where, when, and how Townsend's first settlers lived their lives. On September 6, 1676, Major William Hawthorne, a colonist of Salem, was granted 1 square mile of 640 acres near what the intersection of Highlands and Wallace Hill Road at the top of the hill. And many of you have probably seen this marker. This grant was by way of a reward from King Charles II of England. Some specific was at the time approximately marked with a large H carved into a tall hemlock tree. At that time, Groton was the nearest inhabited settlement, and no one was to settle on Hawthorne's grant for the next 43 years. Next came the creation of Northtown. The Massachusetts Colonial General Court voted on December 7th, 1719, to create 2 new adjacent towns of 36 square acres. And these 2 settlements were at first called Northtown, which became Townsend, and Southtown, which became Lunenburg, and they were referred to together as Turkey Hill. I'm glad the name didn't stay Turkey Hill. Requirements for settlement of Northtown were agreed upon in 1923, and they included the following. There had to be at least 80 people, adults that is, who would pay £5 each, which at the time it would have been around $364 for their plots of land, and they would draw lots for their plots of land, and they would each build a house on their plot of land. The settlement would build a meeting house and hire a preacher. Those were always 2 requirements for towns, for settlements in those days. The settlement center. And as a point of reference for this, nearby Groton by this time had twice suffered devastating attacks and raids by the Native Americans. During the first, in King Philip's War, in March 2nd, 1670, natives attacked for 2 weeks before the settlers abandoned the town, and it was destroyed. They were attacked during King William's War by Abnakis, who killed 20 villagers, including someone in my family tree, and they took 12 captives. So to me, it seems most likely that that is why the town's first center was situated near the top of Mount Grace, which we know today is Meeting House Hill. For centuries, castles and forts and villages around the world had been built in the highest positions possible for defensible protection against approaching enemies. In 1728, the first child was born in Northtown to Mary and John Patt. A church was not built until 1730, and a preacher was not hired for 5 more years. Before that, some people walked or traveled to Groton to attend an established church there. So people started living here in the 1720s, but there were more steps before the actual town was recognized. And Taber, would you put on the next slide?
Yep, I think that should be coming through in a moment.
The town was incorporated. Okay, and that will be a map.
Yep, that should
Anyway,
be.
the town was incorporated with a charter in 1732. Now, I looked for an early map and I found this one in Sawtell's history. As you can see, it is not a map from this time. There's West Townsend is on it and Townsend, but it does show the boundary set in 1732 when the town was incorporated with a charter. So the boundaries were those set then. The first church services were held in 1734. Phineas Hemingway, who had recently graduated from Harvard, which was then strictly a divinity school, was the first pastor. As was common at the time, he was also expected to serve as the schoolmaster, and he served in this joint position for 26 years until his death in 1760. Of course, he was a college graduate, so of course he would know enough. He'd be the one to teach the children. And the next slide shows us the location of the first school, which Hemingway got to teach in for some of the time. And you've probably seen pictures, recent pictures of this marker monument for the first school, which the Boy Scouts have recently worked to clear the site so that people can. I'll repeat, his epitaph reminds us that he was sound in faith, zealous in the cause of God, meek and patient under trials, diligent in improving his talents, and faithful to his Lord and the souls of his people. All right. The second pastor was the Reverend Samuel Dix, who served for 36 years from 1761 until his death in 1797. And the next slide is a picture of Reverend Dix's stone. And we'll hear more about him, thank you, later in the talk. He lived in the first parsonage, which was donated and built on Mount Grace, or Meeting House Hill. And he was said to have been dignified, without coldness or arrogance, cheerful without levity, and strictly courteous and condescending in his deportment. He urged his flock to be patient and endure hardship, and he preferred a moderate course during the Revolutionary War. So we'll hear more about that later. During his tenure, a new and larger meeting house was built in 1771, by which time the town's population had increased to around 700. And the next slide is at the top of the road on Meeting House Hill. This monument is here today. You may have seen it. It's at the site of both the first church, 1730 to 1771, and the second church, which stood on this site from 1771 to 1804. At this point, the town was still known as Northtown. And the next slide will show us what Viscount Charles Townsend. And in 1800, Northtown became officially known as the town of Townsend, Townsend. He was known as Turnip Townsend, as he came up with a 4-crop rotation system in England, which helped farmers not to deplete their soil for their crops. He was His Majesty George III Secretary of State. Also in 1800, the Reverend David Palmer, the town's third pastor, was ordained. He served from 1800 to 1830, and he died in 1849. But he's not buried in the old burying ground, as some of the land that he owned was used to create the hillside cemetery, and that's where he is. But sometimes during the summer, the water sources on Meeting House Hill dried up. People began saying that the meeting house and the burying ground were too far apart. Around this time, the center of the town began to shift off of Meeting House Hill and nearer to the river, where water was plentiful and mills were beginning to be built. The present center of Townsend is more than 2 miles from its beginnings on Mount Grace. In 1801, the New Hampshire Turnpike was built through Townsend, extending to Keene and Walpole, New Hampshire, and bringing more traffic through that part of town. The next slide will show where the meeting house was moved to in 1804 by teams of oxen to its present location, and it now serves as the Townsend Methodist Church. At first, it faced the river, but it was later turned around 180 degrees to face the turnpike. Of course, when this building stood on Meeting House Hill, it didn't have the tower, and it was just a large rectangular building. These things were added later. And since several of those buried in the old burying ground were Revolutionary War soldiers and their families, I think a brief review of Townsend's part in this conflict is in order at this point. And I don't have too many pictures of it, but the next slide represents the Revolutionary War. And this is a picture I took in September 2019 from the encampment at the Reed House with the Townsend Minutemen. On January 5th, 1773, a town meeting was held at the Meeting House in response to a letter and a pamphlet sent from Boston requesting that the town pass resolves concerning the rights and privileges of free members of society and their willingness to die if necessary to maintain these rights. A 5-member committee of correspondence was set up, agreeing that they found the course of the mother country oppressive and unjust, and that their rights had been violated. At 3 p.m. on April 19th, 1775, a cannon was fired on the common as an alarm, calling the able-bodied men ages 16 to 65 to assemble, and 2 companies were formed. Captain James Hosley's company was in Colonel William Prescott's regiment. The muster roll included 73 men from Townsend, Pepperell, and Ashby. Initially, they marched to Cambridge and served about a 21-day term of enrollment, which later proved to be too short a time to learn the ropes before they were sent home, and other fresh volunteers were sent in. So later, the term was increased. Captain Samuel Douglas's company, the second company, after serving 5 days, was sent back to Townsend to tend to the Tories there, and we'll get back to this in a little while. During the war, there were repeated calls to action, and from Townsend as from other places, a few enlisted at a time and left with companies being formed in other towns and counties. About 30 to 35 men from Townsend were away at any one given time. Townsend could be proud that all of its selectmen, the town clerk, and representatives to the general court served, as those who could afford could hire substitutes to go in their place. About 35 from Townsend fought in Captain Henry Farwell's company under Prescott's command at the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 7, 1775. Most of these had been with Captain Hosley on April 19th. In the hard-fought battle, the colonists ran out of ammunition and had to retreat to Cambridge. Of those men who fought at Bunker Hill, Archibald McIntosh was killed, and Oliver Stevens was wounded and died in prison. 1775 was a bad year in Townsend in more ways than one. The summer of 1775 was unusually hot and dry in this area. With many heads of the households away at war, crops failed. There was much sickness with fever and dysentery and many deaths, and it was a most discouraging time. By the time the war ended on September 3rd, 1783, Townsend had lost a total of 6 or 7 men. Ithamar Sawtell states in his 1878 History of Townsend that the exact number cannot be correctly ascertained. We know that among those who died were Israel Richardson, Private James Locke, who was just a teenager, Captain Hosley's own son, James Jr., who was about 17. He died at White Plains, New York, and around 3 others. Captain Hosley's son, John, who was a little younger than his brother James, died in 1778 and is buried here, and we will look at his stone later. Some other locals not already mentioned who played leadership roles in military positions included Captain Thomas Warren, who was Townsend selectman and general court representative, Captain Daniel Sherwin, whose great-grandson was a founding partner in the Sherwin-Williams Paint Company, Lieutenant Ephraim Heald, Lieutenant Nathan Conant, Captain James Kidder, the great-grandfather of Meddy French Homer, Captain John Campbell, Lieutenant Richard Wire, Second Lieutenant James Locke, and drummer Nathaniel Bagley, and others. Now, a little more about Captain James Hosley. According to Sawtell, James Hosley was the most prominent and influential among the old heads in Townsend in these times. He was born here in 1734 into a large and respectable family. As no school had yet been built in town, you could say he was homeschooled. In Townsend, he was a church deacon, selectman, town moderator, and town clerk, as well as captain of the Minutemen. In 1776, he was made captain of a Middlesex County militia with Peter Butterfield, also from Townsend, as his first lieutenant and Benjamin Ball as second lieutenant. He was once again chosen captain in the fall of 1777 to assist General Gates against Burgoyne at Saratoga, leading 170 men from Townsend, Pepperell, and Ashby. Remembered as a modest, courteous, and obliging man, he died in 1809, and I discovered that he's actually buried in Hancock, New Hampshire, where he moved sometime after the war. Okay, back to that nest of Tories. Now, if you really think about it, the Revolutionary War was almost a civil war of sorts, as many of the early settlers had come from England, and most of them still had family there, parents, brothers, cousins, and friends. During the Revolutionary War, every man, however poor, was called upon to act to the full extent of his abilities to defend and protect his life and rights against the British forces, or be considered a Tory or loyalist, a traitor. Those not giving their undivided support to the American cause could be prosecuted by a special court of sessions and imprisoned or even tarred and feathered. Such men were at first watched and sometimes asked to promise greater conformity. In Townsend, a committee was chosen to collect evidence and help ferret out the loyalists. The Reverend Samuel Dix, the second pastor, who was known to have pursued a moderate course in the war, was called upon to help make up this list, perhaps to prove his loyalty to the colonial cause. In July 1776, Townsend selectmen posted a list of men deemed to be dangerous or unfriendly to the American cause, which was presented at a legal town meeting. Some of those on the list came over to the Patriot side shortly thereafter. There appear to have been about a dozen Tories in town who secretly opposed all measures to resist the authority of Great Britain, and they all lived on or around Wallace Hill. Now, you may recall that Captain Samuel Douglas and his company of men had been sent back after 5 days of service to tend to the local Tories, most of whom had previously been their neighbors. A Mr. Searle, who lived near the burying ground, was trapped in his house before he could escape. But as a ruse, his brother broke out some boards at the back of the house and took off running. And he was pursued, and this allowed his Tory brother to escape undetected. Some of the local Tories were arrested and taken to Townsend Harbor to be guarded and confined in a cooper's shop where they were fed by their family members. It is said that from here, they verbally harassed and threatened passing militia members walking on the road past them to war. 2 or more Tories from Townsend were rounded up and taken to Boston to be guarded with others of their kind or sent back to England. They were not to be allowed to return to the towns of their previous residence. Some fled even before they could be rounded up into the woods without any extra food or clothing, and from there to other parts. Townsend's very obnoxious Joshua Smith left this country, as did Jonathan Wallace, Seth Johnson, Ebenezer Giles. Dr. Joseph Adams of Townsend probably fled as he was listed as absentee when the war ended. And according to the terms of the Confiscation Act, his real estate holdings, including 2 farms, were sold to benefit the town. At the end of the war, there was pressure by the absentees and runaway Tories to be allowed to return to their former homes, but this wish was not granted to them. They were to be considered internal enemies and declared traitors and ought never to be suffered to return, but excluded. Okay, we can now see again the old burial ground marker, now that we've revisited some of the basic facts about Townsend's beginnings, and we'll turn our attention to the actual old burying ground. And I'd like to begin the actual history of the old burying ground with a quotation from Catherine Wilson's talk on the subject to the Townsend Women's Club in 1999, which I only recently became aware of. Because I really think that this quote puts things in a proper perspective for us when we visit any cemetery. People think that burying grounds are places for the dead, and they are, but they're also places for the living. And isn't that why we're here to look at this place today? Around 400 early settlers of Townsend are buried here, including several Revolutionary War veterans. All of the stones face south, unlike many later cemeteries where stones were placed facing east to face Christ at the resurrection. It can be noted that the stones here seldom give birth dates, but instead record the deceased's year and age at death. The earliest burials here occurred without stones to mark their locations at all. and the first gravestones were simple slabs of slate without inscriptions. Although the first known burial was in 1735, Townsend did not acquire this 1-acre plot, which came to be called God's Acre, until 1742, when William Clark gifted it to the town to use as a community cemetery. He was a shoemaker from Concord, and he was one of the first 80 people to purchase land in Townsend in 1720. He lived on Meeting House Road, and he died in 1756. And the next slide shows his stone, a slate stone that is still, considering that, in fairly good condition, and just left of the center of the burial ground. The next slide shows the stone of his wife, Eunice. And if you can see, there's an E at the end of Clark on her stone. At the early stones, things were spelled different ways often. And there's a strange primitive death head on her stone. Her stone says, "Here lies the body." It looks like a lowercase y, but it was actually pronounced that word in those days, using the old word ye for the. And the word relict is also on her stone, which means widow, indicating that she survived him. The next slide shows William Clark's daughter, Susanna's stone. She died at age 17, and apparently she was the child of his first wife, Sarah, as we know that Sarah did not survive him. Her stone has a portrait style depiction rather than a death head at the top, which looked more like a more realistic depiction of a human, and it was also known as a cameo. And her stone also has the curved shoulders on the sides to resemble a headboard of a bed. And we say rest in peace. In 1747, it was voted to fence the burying ground on all sides with a stone wall 4 feet and 4 inches high. And the next slide is a very old picture, which I did not take. This, Taber helped me find this in the archives at the Reed House. It was under a file of celebrations, and it comes from a booklet from the Townsend's 1907 Old Home Days celebration. And it shows that the stone, where the stone wall was in front of the old burying ground. Catherine Wilson had heard that gravestones were once outside this wall, and that they were said to mark the graves of people who had died of smallpox. If anyone knows anything about this, or where that came from, I would be very curious to know. On closer inspection of the photo, I don't think that those are gravestones. Something is outside the stone wall, but they look more like guardrail-like posts or hitching posts. And I can find no record of smallpox victims in Townsend. And although smallpox victims were usually not buried in regular cemeteries, I don't believe that they would have been buried so close to the road. So here's a little mystery that I'd like to know more about if anyone has any information. There are in the old burying ground, in addition to those burials marked with stones, a number of unmarked graves, as can be found in most early burying grounds. Town records show that many of these graves were those of the poorest citizens who were buried at the town's expense, as their families could afford nothing more. Catherine Wilson mentioned that a poor woman named Molly Sloan was once paid for digging some of these graves at the back of the old burying ground. As no cement liners were used in these most basic of burials, such grave sites caved in over time and were filled in with acidic soil from the woods, making these sinking plots prone to the growth of moss, as we often see in old cemeteries. As time passed, some people began to complain about the ugly brown spots that they were forming in this area, and these places were then limed and seeded. By the mid-1800s, bushes and trees were growing all over this burying ground, which had been neglected for years. The Townsend Grange and various veterans organizations then took on the tasks of cleaning out the grounds and straightening up the stones. In 1947, the cemetery commissioners and workers relaid the stone wall and reset any markers that had fallen or been pushed over. I don't know when the stone wall in front of the cemetery was removed. As you can see, this cemetery is very different from Riverside Cemetery in West Townsend, which we visited last fall. Its slate stones look very much alike. And the next slide shows one of the very few family plots that is in this cemetery. There are a lot in Riverside. And this has the granite curbstone around the side of it. This is a Fessenden family plot. The stone on the left is for Marinda Fessenden. I couldn't read the other one. There are other Fessendens buried in the old burying ground also. In earlier times, sheep were pastured here to cut the grass, but they may have done more harm than good, Catherine Wilson says, rubbing against and even knocking down some of the stones. In later times, gravestone rubbings may have chipped and damaged some of the stones. What impresses me the most is that accurate records have been passed down to us of such facts as who gave this land to be used for burials and when the date of the first recorded burial was. And accurate records exist of all the names, dates, complete epitaphs, motifs, and inscriptions on all the stones here. Although the earliest known burials in Townsend are located here, there are no stones with crude skulls and crossbones as in even earlier times. Some death heads with wings do exist and some cameo or portrait-like faces. Cherubs are mostly found on the stones of children, and sadly there are lots of them. The top section of the old slate stones where the design may be found is known as the tympanum or lunette. Many of these old stones have rounded tops and some have shoulders on the sides of the rounded parts. Later on, taller, wider, and more elaborate stones became popular. A few marble stones exist here, but they're actually harder to read in general as the marble does not stand up well to weathering and lichens. By 1816, weeping willows and urns were popular designs on the stones. Someone asked me on the tour in Riverside last fall what AET indicates on a gravestone. And this is from the Latin anno aetatis, which means at the age of, or in the year of his age. Almost all the gravestones here are slate, and fewer made of the more popular, the marble, which became popular later, such as one for Ben Wheeler, who died in 1856. The Hillside Cemetery's first burial took place in 1819, but a few were still buried in the old burying ground after that date in family plots there. Looking now at some examples of mottos, images, and inscriptions found here, you will see, and Thank you.
Mhm.
This is the stone of Lieutenant Peter Butterfield, who fought in the Revolutionary War. I believe he was a first lieutenant. And this has the typical weeping willow and urn on his stone. And the next stone we'll see is for Amos Warren. And you can see the AET. You might be able to see the
Mhm.
AET, meaning at the age of. The next stone is that of Zacchaeus Whitney, and that says Memento Mori. And there are many stones in this cemetery that do say Memento Mori, which means be mindful of death. And this stone is in very good condition. The next stone is that of Joseph Stevens, who died in 1756. And that's another remarkably legible stone. And it also, it has the Y for ye body of. The next stone that we will look at shows the Greek letter sigma, which resembles a lowercase f and was often used in early stones in place of an S. We can see that this is the stone for Samuel Wesson, and the sigmas are in the word Wesson. He died in 1772. But the next stone of William Wesson, who died in 1819, a bit later, there are S's used in Wesson instead of the sigmas. In 1910, Ella Webster and her father, I hear Susan Teachout told me that Ella Webster's father was a town clerk, but so far I haven't been able to find what his first name was. There should be a record somewhere, but in 1910, Ella Webster and her father, realizing the value of preserving the information recorded on these aging stones, meticulously copied by hand in a notebook, which is at the Reed House, and I have seen. They copied all the epitaphs, motifs, and inscriptions on each stone and devised a system to denote the location of every existing headstone by row and number. And it is indeed fortunate for us and for future generations that they recorded all this information, as by now, many of the plain unmarked stones that they found, as well as some of the headstones that were marked at that time, are now no longer there. And many epitaphs of still existing headstones are no longer legible. In around 1941, Henry Hallowell compiled a vital records book for Townsend, which includes burial records up to that time for all 3 cemeteries in Townsend. I know that is available at the New England Genealogical Association in Boston, but I don't think it is available in this town. For the old burying ground, he lists 404 names and 300 stones. Well, this is further indication that there are many unmarked graves here today. And the next slide is a picture I took from the very rear of the old burying ground. And you see that there is much space in that area with no gravestones, but obviously the ground is uneven and burials have taken place here. Most recently, Townsend Historical Society member Susan Teachout, having a lifelong interest in and passion for the old burying ground, has researched and painstakingly compiled the existing information, historical biographies of some of those resting here, listed the Revolutionary War patriots, and more, and organized all this into an easy to explore access online entitled Old Burying Ground, Highland Street, Townsend, Massachusetts, Headstones, Epitaphs, Ancestry, and Revolutionary War Patriots. This is, among other things, a great resource for genealogy enthusiasts looking for their ancestors, and there are also maps to help one find the graves. I'm just going to mention a few interesting stones in the old burying ground that you might want to find on your own. And there are, I don't have a slide for this first one, as in the time I was there, I didn't find it, but I'm sure it's there. The first one is a stone of Ensign William Stevens, who died in 1758. Now, this is before the Revolutionary War. His stone has an uncharacteristic point at the top. Military veterans who died before the Revolutionary War, for instance, in the French and Indian War, would have had British flags placed at their stones at the time. An old cemetery that you might have seen along Route 113 in Dunstable still carries out that tradition. And the next slide should show Major Jonathan Hubbard's stone in the center of the burying ground to the left. And he died in 1761, which is also before the Revolutionary War. This is a remarkable stone. There's a lovely angel blowing a trumpet on the top of his stone, and the words memento mori are there, remember death. So let's just take a look at a few other headstones and of some of the Revolutionary War veterans who are buried here. The next stone is that of Daniel Adams. That's in very good condition and very legible. The next one is for Captain Isaac Kidder. That's in the very front of the cemetery towards the left. He was the great-grandfather of Mattie Homer French, who was Mattie French Homer, who was the sister-in-law of the artist Winslow Homer. And the next one is the stone of Lieutenant Amos Whitney, another one that's very legible. The well-known lie here beside those who lived more ordinary lives. Now, while I was doing this research, my son, Chris, discovered that a family related to us is resting here as well, which is something I did not know. Sarah Haywood Brooks, an 8th great aunt, I think, of mine, married Benjamin Brooks II. They did not use junior or senior at the time. They lived in Townsend, and they had 9 children. In August 1747, 5 of the children, ranging in age from 1 to 25, died, and Sarah herself died the next month. The next stone is the stone for young Abner Brooks. I think he was around 8 years old, who died then. His older sibling, Seth, lies nearby. Several of the children's stones are missing, and their deaths were likely due to an epidemic of some sort. There was a measles epidemic and a throat distemper epidemic in Massachusetts that year. Sarah's son Benjamin survived and served as a captain in the Revolutionary War, and he is buried here, as is her husband Benjamin, who remarried. Life was hard, and survival to adulthood was not always guaranteed. We will end our tour today with a look at perhaps the best known person to have been buried in our old burying ground. And this is a portrait of Henry Price at age 40. He is sometimes referred to as the father of Freemasonry in America. He lived from 1697 to 1780. He was born near London, England in 1697, came to Boston around 1732 at the age of 26. In 1733, he was appointed by warrant from the Grand Lodge of England as Provincial Grand Master of Masons in New England. That same year, he was also appointed cornet in Governor Jonathan Belcher's troop of guards with the rank of major and became known as Major Price. This was just an honorary position of standard bearer. It was not an actual military position. In Boston, Henry became a successful tailor and shopkeeper, and he retired to Townsend in 1761. In Townsend, Price served as representative to the provincial legislature in 1764 and 1765 and owned an estate of several hundred acres, including farms, mills, and shops. He married Mary Townsend when she was 17, and they had a daughter, Mary. When his wife died in 1752, he married Mary Tilden, who died in 1759, and his daughter, Mary, died in 1760. In 1771, when he was 75 years old, he met and married young Lydia Randall, a young widow with one son, and together they had two daughters, Mary and Rebecca. Henry died in 1780 at the age of 83, 6 days after being hit in the abdomen by a glancing blow from an axe while splitting rails, and he was buried in the old burying ground. And the next slide shows his stone, which was erected in the old burying ground. It was quite a large stone. It was said to be about a yard square, 36 inches. I'm not going to read everything that is on his stone, as most of it I've already told you about. I'll just read at the end, leaving a widow and 2 young daughters with a numerous company of friends and acquaintances to mark his departure, who have that ground of hope concerning his present lot, which results from his undissembled regard to his Maker and extensive benevolence to his fellow creatures, manifested in life by a behavior consistent with his character as a Mason and his nature as a man, an honest man, the noblest work of God. So, Henry Price died in 1780, and he was buried in the old burying ground, somewhere near the center. And I've seen this picture of his stone there. But I'd also seen a monument to him in Hillside Cemetery. So I asked Pam Hagan at the Townsend Cemetery Department how this could be. She told me that she would see what she could dig up. And as it turned out, she was literally right. Mm-hmm. In 1857, Masonic officials from Boston searched for and found the resting place of Henry Price in the old burying ground, and with the stone fractured, as you see here, almost through the entire length, but still quite legible. They began an effort to move Henry for reburial with elevated status. And so, after resting in peace for over 100 years in the old burying ground, Henry Price's remains were removed and reinterred in 1888 in Hillside Cemetery in a family plot endowed by the family of Albert Fessenden. And a large granite block monument was placed there and dedicated by Governor Endicott. The original gravestone was removed to the Grand Masonic Lodge building on Boylston and Tremont Streets in Boston. Every year, Masonic delegations still visit Price's current resting place in honor of their patron and founder on the Sunday in May that falls closest to the date of his death, which was May 20th.
Again for a moment.
in 2008, an especially large delegation of Masons descended to pay tribute, marking the 275th anniversary since the founding of the Masons in America. Henry Price has now been resting in peace in Hillside Cemetery for over 130 years, after resting in peace in the old burying ground for over 100 years. He is gone, but certainly not forgotten. I think this is a good place to stop this history of the old burying ground, and it also forms a good transition to a tour of the oldest section of Hillside Cemetery, which I hope you'll join me for in 2021. I also hope that you will want to visit the old burying ground to do some exploring on your own at your own time and pace. Now, please keep in mind there's not much parking available off the road there, and that you should not drive into the burying ground. So until next time, thank you for joining me here today. Thank you. And if people have questions, if I can, I will attempt to answer them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lee. I think we all should give you a round of applause. I know it's not as glory filled as it is when you're in person, but on Zoom everyone's muted, so they don't come through as well. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, I should be able to, if you, I guess, raise your hand. It looks like Dana's got a question, or no, he's clapping. It's hard to tell if someone's raising their hand or if they're clapping sometimes on Zoom. But if you let me know if you have a question, I can try to get it to Lee in just a moment. You will have to unmute yourself though. Let's see here. Well, while we're waiting for other questions to come in, I had a question about materials in cemeteries in New England, because we do have a wide variety, everything from like marble to granite oftentimes, or slate. And I was wondering what you see preserving the best or remaining legible the longest.
Well, some of the slate stones we found today are very legible, actually. And the granite, the polished granite ones that are etched today usually stand up pretty well, but I know my grandfather's in Connecticut, we're going to have to clean that up because lichens do even grow on them.
Yeah, we were noticing that at the schoolhouse monument as well. It's sort of being taken over by lichen at this point as well.
Well, there are things that can be done to clean that off. I haven't looked them up, but I have some resources. The Good Cemeterian has some tells some ways that can be done without injuring the stones, damaging.
Good to know. Yeah, we'll have to look into that.
Right. Some of the sources that I used for this were Ithamar Sawtell's History of the Town of Townsend, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, from the grant of Hawthorne's Farm, 1676 to 1878. Richard Smith's Divinity and Dust, A History of Townsend, Massachusetts, and Richard Smith's Village Hooped in Steel. Susan Wolfrey's Old Burying Ground Headstones, Epitaphs, Ancestry, and Revolutionary War Patriots. The Old Burying Ground Lecture by Catherine Wilson, which she gave at the Townsend Women's Club in 1999. History of the Churches of Townsend, published by Townsend Historical Society in 1973. www.peoplelegacy.com, Old Burying Ground Burial List, Townsend, Mass. MasonicGenealogy.com, www.findagrave, Massachusetts Book of the Dead, and the Townsend's Old Home Days booklet, 1907, which is at the Reed House. Okay.
That's right. We had
and a big thank you to Taber Morell and Ryan Hayward, Susan Teachout, and my family and others who helped.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. We're really looking forward to next year's presentation as well. Hopefully by that time we'll be back person to person again.
Yes, yes. The
But,
Hillside Cemetery is beautiful this time of year. It would be great to be walking there. Yes.
Yeah. Hopefully 2021 we'll be able to do Hillside Cemetery together with cider
Yeah.
donuts as well. We got to get that tradition going again. All right. Thank you all very much for coming today.
Yes, thank you very much. Take care.